Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good evening. My name is Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to our Monday night strategic discussion and overview. I'll be joined by Michael Stager. Today is Monday, November 27th. Tonight's discussion will be centered around the topic of expect the unexpected. Enemy is in a panic. We're going to take up a few key strategic points that are essential to this determining the direction of our nation, of our nation's future. First of all, let me just say that we are only 50 days away from the first Iowa caucus, and President Donald Trump is in a decisive lead. Now, what does that mean in terms of the strategic picture and what's going on in the world? Well, the areas that we want to take up tonight are, one, the Israel and Palestine hostage exchange and what's happening with the war situation going on in Israel and Palestine, the ceasefire, as well as understanding what President Trump's inspired Abraham Accords means for this fight. Also, we're going to discuss the Ukraine war is entirely lost, and that Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is in a total damned situation, that there's no winning strategy for Ukraine at this time, as the globalists, the warmongers, continue to push both the war in Ukraine and to push Russia further to push further attacks against Russia. The situation there is continuing to be dangerous, as well as those who are pushing war in the Middle East between the Palestinians and Israel. But as has been continuously stated, and the reason why you're seeing growing poll numbers for President Trump is he has made clear his commitment is to bringing about a lasting peace. And we're going to discuss how we go about doing that and why we have to amp up our fight for putting President Trump back in the White House in 2024. As said, we're only 50 days away from the Iowa caucus. And finally, on the question of the issue, the very important strategic issue at hand is the economy. And any real revival of the United States economy is going to be determined on getting more people to understand the importance of President Donald Trump's Agenda 47, putting the American people back to work, and addressing what a real economic strategy is, as opposed to what we see that happened at the recent APEC summit in San Francisco, the climate agenda that's being pushed, the anti-growth, anti-human agenda, which is now going to be the top subject of discussion at the upcoming COP28 meeting that is going to be led by the special envoy to Biden, John Kerry. So finally, what I want to mention, and Michael's going to take this material up in detail and then we can have some discussion on it, is the key to not only developing a sound strategy for economic growth in the country is President Trump's Agenda 47, as I said, but as you will see on our LaRouche PAC website, the report and discussion that has been put out by Brian Lance and Susan Kokinda on President Trump's missile defense and how that has to be a central point for a strategic and economic driver, for economic policy driver for the nation. So we put out some material on what President Trump's his missile defense policy means and what would be required to pull that program together in terms of defense of the nation, both economically and militarily. So why don't we go into those subject areas, Michael, and you can start with your opening remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Keisha. Sounds great. Well, I think as many of you on this call know, and we appreciate you participating, this is we're less than a year now from the presidential election. Many of us, I think, on this call, if not all, understand the importance of what that means. Now, if you've been watching some of the news coverage or following President Trump on Truth Social, you'll know that the demographics of our country are changing quite dramatically politically. I saw an article today that referenced the panic inside the White House because they're losing their grip on the black vote. In many places, either nationally or in specific swing states, Trump is polling to even win the category of black men. He's winning many of the age demographics that are younger. In one poll, Biden is really only getting the over 65, and it's probably all the people still watching CNN. So for some people, I mean, there's reason to be excited about that at some level. The American people have not been cowed by the incessant propaganda machine. They see the destruction, they see the chaos, they see the economic pain, they feel it, the economic hurt. They see the chaos on the open border, they see the international threats of world war, of religious war. So it's not really surprising, it's reassuring. But if for anyone who's been through this dance before, and I think we all have in 2020, it wasn't until really March of the election year where they sprung on what was nothing less than a military psyops called COVID. There may be other elements there, but it was ultimately a controlled operation run against the American people and largely to disaffect Trump's support. So to sit here in November of 2023 and say things are looking good, let's just hold steady, would be the wrong approach. We have to look at an enemy that is facing significant strategic losses, one of which, of course, is the discussion on January 6th, the new footage that's becoming released, the 40,000 hours of tapes that are going to continue to erode this narrative that somehow there was this kind of illegal insurrection on January 6th. There's been Trump cases that keep Trump off the ballot. Those have lost. But even those are pale in comparison to what's happened in Ukraine. People may know that the most recent battle is in an area called Avdiivka. This is an area northwest of the Donetsk city and within the Donetsk province in southeast Ukraine. It is one of the most heavily fortified probably areas in the world. And it looks like the Russians have thrown armored vehicle after armored vehicle and tank at this thing to basically wear down the Ukrainian defenses and artillery. And it looks like they may eventually in the near term, have a complete success at taking the city, the town, and the defenses. And that will only be, that could very well just be the one straw that breaks the camel's back. The Ukrainian people have been destroyed by this, as we've covered before, but massive outflow of migration of people. They're now recruiting people, apparently reported from 7 to 70, including women. That doesn't sound good. I think everybody can tell that's an army that won't fight. And it just shows you the decimation of the young men of Ukraine, needlessly, in this globalist NATO, British imperial war. Now, what the terms of that Russia are going to take is not clear. There are many in the West, inside the White House in London. It was just confirmed by a Ukrainian MP, a member of the Ukrainian parliament, that indeed Boris Johnson, Biden, others shut down, but Boris Johnson was deployed to shut down the negotiations between Zelensky's administration and the Russian Putin administration in Turkey within the March, April period of the beginning of the war. There was a sense of a ceasefire. The terms that Russia was offering then were fairly straightforward. The terms are going to be drastically different because Russia has lost upwards of 20 to 50,000 men, possibly more. There's been terrorist acts that have killed and targeted leading figures intellectually, or some of the journalists in Russia that have been covering the war. And so the Russians are very hot and heated, much like the Israelis have been since the October 7th attack in Israel. So it's worth reminding that people like Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, said that we can't lose in Ukraine. There would be no purpose for NATO if we can't win the war in Ukraine. Now, they may walk that back and maintain NATO. They probably like to freeze the process, freeze the conflict, bring Ukraine into NATO, and massively dump more and more troops, create military movements throughout all of Europe, militarize the Baltics and Poland. You know, there's all kinds of, I'm sure, schemes and plots. But these are the schemes and plots of people increasingly joining Hitler in his bunker. This is not a good scenario for them. And so, again, these are the institutions, legacy institutions that the American people no longer support. We don't support the forever wars. There is no support for NATO. There's no support for Latvia if they get into a conflict with Russia. There's no support for Montenegro if they get involved in a conflict with Russia or some other nation. So the post-war, post-Berlin Wall system, this kind of globalist unipolar system that was basically dominated by NATO and forever wars, is confronting a real fundamental crisis. And for that reason, their willingness to escalate even more irrationally than what was the insane support, self-destructive support of Ukraine, of the Zelensky regime against Russia. As many analysts have said, it's like as if thinking Mexico could win a war against the United States. No matter what arms you provided Mexico, the United States could not tolerate a defeat. Neither can Russia. So this is in the near term, though. Even maybe at latest in the spring, we're looking at decisive outcomes, or at least accelerating changes in Russia's deployment. The same nature there is unfolding now in what we've seen in the increased chaos in the Middle East. So, and this pits a much more complex potential strategic danger, I think, as everyone knows, because of the heated temperatures of the Israelis after such a horrific terrorist attack by Hamas. You have Hamas, which has set up an underground military base, in essence, which is a clear military target, except civilians live above it. So, of course, this makes it incredibly problematic and has created outrage internationally over the deaths of civilians from Israeli bombing. But on Wednesday, you have a likely deployment out of Turkey, a member of NATO, let's not forget, and yet a nation that has increasingly approached an independent foreign policy, independent even of NATO. That's really what independent means these days to some degree, but an independent outlook that has close ties with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is this international Islamic faction that is the kind of, at least the parental umbrella for groups like Hamas. Erdogan is the leading representative of this, but they're supposed to deploy 1,000-ship flotilla, upwards of 1,000 ships, to provide aid and resources into Gaza as early as Wednesday. It could arrive as early as Friday. Now, the last time Turkey attempted to do this to alleviate some of the blockade or lack of resources in Gaza, as well as kind of a political effort on behalf of people of the shared Muslim faith. Israel boarded the ship, and I think a number of people actually were killed in the process. So Israel basically had a military siege of the ship. I don't think that's likely going to be happening with 1,000 Turkish ships, or what flag they fly under. It's not clear to me. But you have a massive U.S. armada. You have a number of NATO ships, part of that kind of NATO armada. You have Russian naval capacity in the Black Sea and perhaps even in the Mediterranean, in Syria. So how quickly this thing could break out into a regional war is unclear. And so people discussing Should Israel be doing a ceasefire? Should there be a hostage release? Should Israel commit to the destruction of Hamas? Well, there's no way that Israel can destroy Hamas. There is potentially ability to destroy all of the tunnels underneath Gaza, but that probably means destroying all of the structures above ground on Gaza, leading to increased cries of genocide, humanitarian violations, total destruction of civilian hospitals and housing, and so on. An ethnic cleansing campaign, attacks, which, in some cases, war is hell and awful. But of course, these criticisms are the kind of the justification of criticisms within this kind of post-World War II era, which have legitimacy. We don't want to see the indiscriminate killing of human beings, especially civilians. So it's a crisis. But the crisis is not merely that of the civilians of Gaza. The crisis is much bigger. It becomes the entire region. And the engagement of Iran, Turkey, and other nations. Now, it's hard to predict what's in the minds of the leadership of the nations of Egypt or of the Gulf, of Saudi Arabia, of Qatar, even of Iran, or even of Turkey. You can't, Syria, Iraq, you can't know what's in their minds. All of them are aware that this is a potential major regional and could become a world war. The biggest problem we have in the world today in terms of the ability to stop this is that even the best people are unwilling to see the globalist component, that the role of, especially as we saw with Boris Johnson's deployment to shut down negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, the British imperial role in that globalist formation to stoke further chaos and destruction. People like Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, as a direct product of these globalist forces, a protege of people like George Pratt Schultz, a leading globalist who looked to undermine Richard Nixon on the Bretton Woods system of Ronald Reagan, and was responsible for the Bush-Cheney administration. So a pretty notorious figure over the last 40, 50 years of American history, is also then the sponsor of someone like Netanyahu. And so this whole environment is set up for an increased level of conflict. And as dangerous as that is, we face a kind of situation, a kind of crisis in the United States that really has to be the increased foundation for this broader movement, this resurgence, this, as it was called during Lincoln's time, the wide awake movement, which of course is such an apropos name given the whole woke agenda, to have people become wide awake. But this kind of American revolutionary upsurge, I just want to document briefly, and then Keisha may have some questions on some of these things. I'm not really going to touch upon, there is a major climate change summit beginning this week. It's the same old of total destruction of all energy supply on this planet. Nations like China and India are basically fly in the face of any of the diktats. They're building massive coal power plants, all of 65%, 2/3 of them in India, probably the same or more in China, built by direct state government involvement. So it's the government saying, screw you. It's not just demand from the population and some corporations looking to make money. It's the state saying, we need this for long-term survival, building coal plants. But for the rest of the world, private finance is largely the means by which economies move. So this summit will look to choke off more and more of this, of funding for what we call fossil fuels, but dense energy supply like oil, coal, natural gas will be shut down by the private financial global institutions. That's what COP meetings are, the conference of the parties, but the global warming, climate change regime is that choke off energy supply via private finance. And that program stemmed out of a policy that was really implemented in the United States by Obama and Biden. And I reference that to touch on something that is critical. I mentioned at the beginning that there have been major demographic changes in terms of how the American people are seeing the political process. As one person put it when they were interviewed, I voted for Biden in 2020. I didn't really realize how good we had it under Trump. I get a second chance. I'm going to vote Trump this time. That's probably a lot of the American people's sense of things right now. But how the propaganda machine and how this world will become even more dramatic, probably in an area I'm not even touching on tonight. But what I do want to touch on is what we as the American patriotic faction have to consider. That since Obama-Biden, the demographic organization of our society has been wrecked. I don't know a better word to put it. It's been wrecked. It's been mangled. What do I mean by that? One, the role that Obama-Biden opened up in terms of the private financial institutions, one, to massively bail them out, but to align them explicitly with this idea that private finance run by the central banks, people like Mark Carney out of the Bank of England, or the Federal Reserve here in the United States, people like Janet Yellen, but that they would align directly with the climate change agenda independent of government outlook. That they were basically encouraging these globalist institutions to operate independent of nations. This is the same thing that the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Trump killed the first time, and Biden is trying to revive it today, where corporations supersede national laws. But and Obama's famous for a number of statements, like we don't need fancy fusion energy, we just need thicker window panes. If everybody had air conditioning in Africa, the whole world would boil over. So just basically, you have to basically live in mud huts here, even though I get to have a Martha's Vineyard mansion. So Obama's famous for it, but what we don't necessarily see is the kinds of, and you hear this about the younger generation, the crisis in the younger people. And maybe this is probably why Trump is winning this, because increasingly some of them realize what we've been given has been a fraud. It's been a con game. We've been conned. So what Obama-Biden brought in was a restructuring of the U.S. employment sectors. We don't have any magic wands to bring back manufacturing, but we'll definitely spend a lot of money, and Biden has certainly done this in spades, on solar panels and windmill and green energy type companies and technologies, things that fundamentally erode the productivity of a nation. And much of this stuff is produced and manufactured elsewhere, outside the United States to begin with. That's one element of it. It's only a very small portion of what we're actually looking at. You have to look at things like gig work, things like Uber drivers, Lyft drivers. These became a dominant part of the employment of the American economy, especially as more and more online shopping took place and people began to just sit at home. And of course, this was part of the COVID phenomena, on steroids. But you had more and more people going to where they were just getting paid per gig, not even hourly wages, no contracts. They're basically all subcontractors. There's no long-term employment. There's no career. You're just getting by on some cool, what you might call a cool gig, cool for a short period of time. Ultimately, any of those gigs were a con game. If you drove Uber, if you drove it so much, you basically ran your car into the ground, and the capital investment took up all the money you made plus some to buy a new car. So it really doesn't, what you thought you maybe were making is $20 an hour quickly became less than minimum wage. Again, though, independent of green energy, independent of the gig work. And remember, this is on top of probably the main component that Obama opened up was, look, everybody just needs to move into finance and real estate. And frankly, you're happy if your children now work at a bank or real estate. It's for profit. It's providing a service. People need investments. People need to buy homes. So before, everybody going into real estate seemed almost like a horrible thing. Why do we need so many real estate agents? At this point, that actually seemed like a good career, given the kinds of insanities that were taking place in some of these other areas. But this is still, we're not even looking at it. They legalized marijuana. They encouraged the legalization of marijuana in various states. So then you have now pot shops set up all over the place. So you have a whole new level of employment of people now just selling drugs, and in part of the drug industry, the illegal narcotic industry, largely marketing to teens with like gummy bear pot, THC laced candy, now is a massive industry with billboards in every state that's legalized. And that's practically every state. I mean, it's 40 something states now, I think, that have legalized pot to some degree. That might be high, but it's certainly on its way there if it's not there already. This has been a dominant shift. So now you have all these young people working either in real estate or finance, if they're lucky, maybe the tech job doing, surveillance, police state surveillance for Facebook or Google or something. You've got gig work, you've got the pot shops, you've got the green energy. But as Bob Ingram documented, you've got people working in so-called charities and nonprofits. And people that are working in charities and nonprofits in this country outnumber the people working in farming or the people working in manufacturing. It's a huge number of people. I mean, I'll try to pull together some of the specific numbers on this and present it and maybe write something up on it so you get a perspective. But I just want to do it in kind of general terms right now, just to give a certain approximation. And this is largely the employment sector then. And what do these charities and nonprofits do? Well, they hand out drug needles. They provide condoms to the homeless. They probably work with they work on providing illegal immigration into the United States, working to help assist the caravans coming through Central America and Mexico. They help work in stealing elections. This is really the Democratic Party machine is no longer a party. It's much more an amalgam of these kinds of nonprofits, charities, get out the votes, these kinds of structures. All of this has been made possible, of course, by almost an unceasing money printing from the Federal Reserve to basically provide huge amounts of money to specific private interests in a small handful of people that then deploy this kind of political agenda, which is nothing less than the total destruction of our country, and really the demographics of our people. And of course, all of this was made necessary to employ people in these kinds of things because we ripped out manufacturing and industry. This is what Keisha points to. Brian Lance has done an interview, which is really an extraordinary good discussion. And he has a paper backing that up, that we hope to publish, that documents that we are starting to see an awareness of this demographic crisis, that we have so few people in manufacturing and industry. And the skill set within those areas is then rapidly diminishing, that we can't even produce enough artillery shells for Ukraine, let alone the necessary military equipment that would be required if we had a major nation-to-nation war with a Russia or a China. Hypersonic warfare, space-based warfare. We are so far gone that some of these, we have 5 now. We used to have 107. We have 5 defense industry companies now. But these companies are realizing we have to start to build out manufacturing capacity for these new advanced technologies. We can't simply build a few prototypes and be able to produce one every 6 months, one artillery shell, hypersonic, missile every 6 months. You'd have to have the ability to do a surge capacity. And as much as it's hard, a little bit unfortunate that we have to discuss about this mobilization within the military sector. It is at least is advanced manufacturing capabilities, and that within our national security apparatus, as Brian describes it, there's a recognition of this Death Valley scenario where we have lost the manufacturing industrial capacity of the country. And you have upwards of 60, 70 to 80% of the generation under 40 today, so from 25 to 40, 25 to 45, who are working in jobs which are literally a net loss to the nation as a whole. That they are not simply providing a minimal service of unskilled labor in real estate or working at a Chipotle burrito shop or something, or at a store in the mall. It's or a restaurant job. They're literally involved in activity, whether it's green energy, narcotics, illegal immigration, various charities, so-called charity work, or gig work that is literally a net loss to the country. And this is a massive demographic shift. We're talking tens of millions of people who will have to be brought back. And there's talk of, and many of you have probably heard this, there's talk of retraining this generation in skilled trades, plumbing, carpentry, pipe fitting, the various skilled trades, electrician work, and so on. That's all great and wonderful. We need all of that. And there's great independence to that. And there's a moral fiber, and small companies that we have in this country thrive to provide those skills from an advanced industrial level to your local, just local town. But you're not going to be able to provide broad-scale employment for tens of millions of people in the skilled trades. You need manufacturing employment on a large scale. Some of these defense contractors are building plants of 65,000 square feet or plots of land of 500 plus acres to build massive new AI, robotic, integrated factories, production facilities for thousands of employees at skilled layers. And they're having to talk with colleges and universities to get the skilled labor from the engineering areas. They'll probably have to talk to some city colleges to get some of the manufacturing capabilities going. And you've got to create an ecosystem within these areas so that every component you're involved in is produced locally within that ecosystem of manufacturing. This is the only way we can pull our country from the brink of total insanity. Because when you can give children or young adults, at this point, young adults, the lack of skills, the lack of knowledge, increased sense of anxiety, increased sense of drug use, an psychotic regime of self-destruction with the wars and everything else, you leave them open to the kind of political unrest we saw during COVID, the summer of Floyd, as some call it. You see the kind of anxiety and rage regarding some of these pro-Palestinian protests on college campuses. I support absolutely the right to defend the Palestinians, but there is something different about the kind of rage and anger that's in some cases targeting the United States itself. That rage and protest is not taking responsibility for the nation as a whole. And it's because of a lack of skill set. And there's certainly an absence of skill sets predominant in the Ivy Leagues and better universities. I mean, they're atrocious. But we've got to secure this, and we've got to secure it. And to do it would be a commitment to provide one of the largest demographic shifts ever in human history, of upwards of 100 million people in one country, in our country alone, let alone in Europe and other nations, going through a rapid reassessment of what's actually necessary in society, what gives real life, real meaning, what makes nations possible, and that nations are a means for young people to act towards the future, that you act to create a coherence within your nation, and within that coherence, you find a sense of mission and a sense to offer your children and grandchildren some kind of future. That is impossible without re-employing tens of millions, 100 million Americans in advanced manufacturing sector. And that can't be done without waging a war on the very core of this globalist system, which is this international financial regime, the central banks, the private financial institutions. We need private financial institutions, but they have to be brought to heel under national sovereignty circumstances and commitments of national banking to fund the necessary elements that give our nation a reason as well as a potential to survive long term. And that really is at the core of an increasing awareness to take what is increasingly a clear-eyed American people, that they see the dangers of this current Biden and liberal regime. They see the potential of returning to Trump. But we need to reawaken this kind of American spirit and clarity on the real uniqueness of the American experiment, which is hinged on this kind of responsibility of citizens towards the economic necessities of our nation. Not simply to get my money, but to contribute physically to the well-being of the country as a whole. And this will stabilize our country's policies across the board for the long term. So anyways, that's a little bit maybe longer than I wanted to go, but I wanted to touch on that, Keisha. So maybe you want to respond. I know you see you put a link in the chat for people.
Yes, that's the link to the interview with Brian that we were just discussing. I want to stay on the economy for a moment, but before I ask the question, I do want to allow people to come in and make comments. So raise your hand to get into the discussion. Press *6 to ask the question. *9. Wait, I said that backwards. Sorry. Press *9 to get into the queue. *6 to unmute yourself if you're on the phone line, or use the raise hand feature. We'll get to questions in just a few moments. But Michael, I want to stay on the economy for a moment. And on this question of directing what Brian and Susan were talking about in this interview in terms of the need for advanced manufacturing, skilled labor, I mean, you think about it from the standpoint that the role of the defense sector in addressing the energy crisis, in addressing manufacturing. Well, Lockheed Martin, you take Lockheed Martin, for example, I'll put it this way. During this upcoming conference in Dubai, where Kerry is supposed to be there actually discussing a plan to commercialization of fusion. Well, you ask the question, how do we get this done if you don't have a focus on advanced manufacturing, skilled labor, putting some of the highest development of technological advancements? If the focus is on just the green energy policy and not on what Trump has said in terms of the need for taking this defense industry and not only just building out a missile defense shield, but what are the implications of that for the advancement of energy? So if you have the Biden administration going with the reduction of manufacturing and pushing for windmills and solar and green, the idea that they would have the capabilities in terms of the resources, materials resources that would be needed to actually seriously build out a commercial fusion global policy is non-existent if that doesn't come from a change in the structure of the economic process happening in the United States. So what Trump is laying out from the standpoint of the missile defense shield, you really have to look at that from the standpoint of what is this going to build out in terms of advancing our economic driver in technological scientific progress again. Lockheed Martin is not just a defense sector. Right now, Lockheed Martin is working on what they call compact fusion. example.
Yeah.
How they're working on these developments of how to advance the space program, fusion energy, other economic and
Isha, are you there? I don't know if it's my internet or yours, but I'm losing the signal a little bit. Keisha, are you there? Can somebody raise their hand to let me know you can hear me? Okay. Okay, thanks. Appreciate it. Well, let me just respond to what Keisha. Okay, we lost Keisha there for a second. So I'll respond to what Keisha said, and then maybe I'll bring in some others to hear what your thoughts are and questions. Looks like we're getting Keisha back. So let me just respond to what, I think Keisha was addressing. One is that, these defense sector firms are not, as she just said, are not merely defense sector firms. They have their advanced technology capabilities, and they can be deployed by national policy towards critical areas, one of which is energy policy. There's a misconception that energy or any of these things are somehow private sector outside the boundaries of national security. That is only something that a stupid academic in Washington could ever think, or people who have been brainwashed by them and what is often referred to as the libertarian school of economics. It's obscene to think that fundamental aspects of infrastructure, energy, and production are not intimately tied to national security, relate directly to national defense, and the long-term health of our population, which is also critical to national security. So the thing that's, and we had a discussion last week with Mike Carr regarding the SpaceX launch of Starship and the broader space industry. But the point Mike often makes, and I want to repeat here, the role of banking and credit becomes critical. You don't want the government picking winners and losers of a small set of firms. In some sense, what Elon Musk has done with SpaceX is build something outside the control of this kind of cartel of advanced industrial firms, largely Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and so on. That he broke the mold and created something that was viable and cost-effective and successful, independent of the kind of the cartel's foot-dragging approach. And what we want to do is provide the credit and banking credit available to any entrepreneur that can demonstrate merit in these fields, in energy and beam defense, but any major advanced technological area, especially things that require broad-scale production or can advance the means of broad-scale production. And we want to make sure that we have the credit available for the power supply to make any manufacturing endeavor as feasible as possible. That practically the energy consumption should be nearly free in terms of industrial terms, because you want that advanced level of production. That's the heart engine of your nation's ability to support its population and to grow. And so these are national security policies, but you have to have the banking component. And it's why this banking question, because we can commit, John Kerry can speak to fusion in Qatar at the COP, climate change summit. And we can have a few fusion companies and they can have a few, Lockheed Martin can produce a very compact fusion machine that fits in the trailer of a truck and that can be used for emergencies or military purposes and so on. But we don't want these things to be of limited use deployments. We want to take whatever advanced technological breakthroughs we're making, whether it's in particle beams, and microwave technologies, and hypersonic, scramjet technology, that might be specific military use or specific space exploration use. We want to have the funding and manufacturing capacity to deploy that into the broad base of the population. We want a population that has the ingenuity and entrepreneurial spirit to grab that and go, knowing that they have the environment of cheap energy supply, advanced manufacturing capacity, and the credit to go out and fulfill their dreams, but most importantly, the requirements of our country. We need to have that commitment. And we're at a point where maybe why this is so important, Keisha, and why, but Brian and Susan's discussion, why these things are so important from our perspective is that we know that when your enemy is in panic, don't sit back and wait and see what they do. We know what they're going to try to pull something. They're going to try to pull more chaos, more confusion, more emotional drama. Hard to imagine what could be more than what happened on October 7th, given our nation's political culture relationship to Israel. But they will attempt to manipulate, even with very financial crises and other scenarios, to manipulate the population. But whatever they're going to pull, it doesn't have to have the effect they intend. It's almost guaranteed not to. But are we going to sit back and wait to see what they do? Or are we going to go on the offensive with the kinds of policies that may not be the most wild? It's not really wild what we're discussing. It's pretty, as Trump often says, common sense. But it scares the living daylights out of the enemy to say you're going to go directly after their global financial centers. You're going to basically limit their ability to operate above and against national interests. And you're going to provide the institutions necessary for our nation to really go aggressively forward. That scares the daylights out of them. And I think that's, at least I want to just put that forward, is that, why this is such an important part of the strategic consideration.
That was okay. There I am. I can see that was.
Oh yeah. Do I need to make you a host again? Maybe
yes,
I do. Yeah.
Because I can't let people in here. Yeah. No, that's exactly it. How are we investing in our physical infrastructure, both the technological, economic infrastructure, scientific infrastructure, and that is, we have to have a credit system. I think what you said about not allowing for the federal government to choose winners and losers is exactly what they're trying to do right now. I'll just say one more thing is, it's the 25th anniversary, just think about this, of 25th anniversary of the launching of the International Space Station. And it's the first modules of it went up in 1998, and human beings started going up it's 25 years and 2 years later in 23. Right now, they're discussing in the early 2030s bringing this down. The Biden administration and NASA is saying that it's going to cost $1 billion for them to decommission, to basically blow the International Space Station up in the atmosphere, and $1 billion so that they can direct it so that the pieces don't blow up in the atmosphere and the debris fall down onto Earth and hit people. But I bring that up is, we can put billions of dollars into a needless war in Ukraine, Russia, put so much money into these wars. But at the same time, actual investing in the future of cooperation amongst nations, humanity, the driver for medical, technological, economic, scientific progress in the United States, we would, just forego that. And at the same time, lose the critical opportunity to give young people access to being a part of building out the infrastructure of the United States. I mean, that's a very important driver for that, both not just having people on low Earth orbit, but what it's actually contributing to the advancement of society, the advancement of our economy. So we have our priorities wrong. We're putting our investments in the wrong place instead of into our future. And so that's why what Trump has laid out, why he initiated the Artemis program, the importance of going back to the inspiration of Trump. I talked about this before around the contributions that were made by his uncle. And we could discuss that more later, but I bring that up in the context of Trump really has his finger on the pulse with this missile defense system, because it really is a driver in the way that LaRouche saw during Reagan with the Strategic Defense Initiative of where you want to take the country, the most sound economic and scientific advancements. So, but you have to have the infrastructure for financing, which means a credit system. So I'm glad you said that. That's directly the point.